And I just wanted to take a moment here to go into a little bit more in-depth coverage of how the combat system works in the One Ring. This being my first video for YouTube, I think I was a little bit all over the map when I'm trying to explain the mechanics a little bit, so if it was a little confusing to follow along in my explanation of how the mechanics work, I apologize. But I wanted to go a little bit more over combat really fast to just make sure that everybody kind of understands the basics of how combat works, so you have an idea of how the game kind of operates. Now, as I said before, combat in the One Ring is abstract, and it doesn't really use a battle grid like you may be used to in Dungeons & Dragons or Pathfinder or anything like that. At the beginning of combat, and I'm going to be looking at a reference I have here on my computer screen to just kind of help me keep things arranged, so I apologize for not always looking dead into the camera here. The beginning of combat, you have what's called onset, and onset is the very beginning sequence of combat. And during the onset, the main task that you have to do is to determine the initiative. Now in this game, to determine initiative isn't by rolling dice like you may be used to in other games, like adding an agility bonus or dexterity or however. In this game, the way you determine initiative is to determine which side of the conflict is defending versus who's attacking. The defending side always gets the initiative. So if your character's in a situation where you're being attacked by the monsters, you're considered to have initiative because you're defending. If you are in a situation where maybe you're running into a camp and trying to rescue prisoners or something and you're the attacking side, the defenders will have the initiative and they'll get to take their attacks first. Now, whenever there's a situation where it's not quite clear to a lore master as to which side has the initiative, you are able to take the highest battle bonus in the group, and battle is an actual skill on the character sheet, and it's listed under the heart attribute, battle here. You can take whoever has the highest battle score in the group and have them roll their skill versus the highest skill amongst the monsters or the enemies. Monsters work by slightly different rules. They kind of have different stats than what characters do, and they operate a little bit differently. They have what's called vocation, and vocation is basically just a rough bonus that they have for all their skills. So you would roll versus the monster's vocation, their battle skill basically, and whoever wins would get the initiative in the conflict. Okay. Now, there's also rules for surprise and how you determine if your characters can surprise the enemy or if the enemy surprises you. And basically, you can handle the roll for battle to try to determine which side gets initiative, just like I said, by that whoever has the highest battle roll, and then you just roll off. Now, another thing that you can do is if you're the defending side or the attacking side, it's just a little bit tougher to do this if you're on the attacking side, is you can see if you get what's called a combat advantage. A combat advantage is basically where you have determined something on the battlefield. You've discovered something that you can use to your advantage, maybe like cover, like rocks that you can use for cover, or tree stumps that you can use to your advantage to kind of turn the tide in a battle. You do this at the beginning during onset, the beginning part of battle, as I said. So after you determined which side's going to go first, which side's defending and which side is attacking, you can also roll battle, your battle skill, to determine if you find some kind of advantageous thing on the battlefield that you can use to get an advantage. And the difficulty number that you have to roll against is determined by the situation. So if your group successfully ambushed the enemy, the target number is only 12. If your group is defending, you roll against a target number of 14, and if the company, which is your group, is attacking, you would roll against a target number of 18, because if you're attacking, you don't have the initiative, and it's harder to get a combat advantage. If you're successful, you get a bonus die, success die, that you can use on one skill roll during the encounter. If you fail, then you don't get the bonus skill die. Now, if you roll what's called a great success, which I described earlier is when you get one of these Tingwar emblems on a success die, that's a great success. You can basically grant a success to one additional party member that may have failed their roll. So if you have a guy in your party that failed his roll for combat advantage and you get a Tengwar symbol, you can grant a bonus die to that player. But when you hand the bonus die to that player, they have to spend it immediately at that point. And you can only use one bonus die at a time. If you rolled 2 Tengwar emblems, which is called an extraordinary success, you could have 2 bonus dice that you could give out to 2 different people in the party to help them make their combat advantage roll. And essentially, combat advantage just gives you bonus success dice that you can use on a task, like an attack roll, for instance. You don't roll damage in this game, so you could use it like as an attack roll or maybe a skill check or something like that. Now, skipping through surprise attacks, which are pretty basic, it's handled similar to how it's handled in other systems, but there are tables that you can use depending on if you are the party that's trying to ambush the enemy or if the enemy's trying to ambush you. The target numbers could be slightly different depending on what's going on there. And there's little tables in the Lore Master's book that tells you how to handle that. It's pretty simple. The first thing you do after determining initiative and determining combat advantage is now each player in the party will choose what stance that their character is going to be in. And stances determine a lot about the combat. And the way that I track stances in my game is I buy little colored circles that I put under character miniatures. And depending on the color of the circle, it will tell you what stance you're in. And you can pick these up at any craft store like Michael's or somewhere like that. Even Walmart carries these little geometric shapes. I use circles. So, because they fit under the circular base of like Dungeons & Dragons miniatures and things like that very well. Red, in my game, represents the forward stance. Orange represents the open stance. Green represents defensive stance. And blue represents rearward stance. And I also downloaded some nice little cards that match these colors of these little circles that I use for the miniatures that a person made up in the community who goes by the name of Skywalker. And these little cards are like little cheat sheets that tell you everything you need to know about each stance. And if you flip the card over, it tells you what you have to do to escape combat, because each character can also try to escape a combat. They can try to flee, basically. So these are nifty little cards, and they're color-coded for the type of stance. They match the colors that I'm using with these little circles to indicate stance on the table. And I'll put links up to where you can get a copy of these cards as well. So thank you to Skywalker for creating those cards. So the way I handle it is when a character puts their miniature down, they put what color they're going to use for their stance underneath their character mini, and then they can pick up a card from the stack that tells them everything they need to know about that stance. Now, as I said before, you choose the stances at the very beginning of combat, during like right after the onset phase that I just mentioned. So each character they'll determine what stance that their character is going to be in, and that stance determines a number of things about the combat. The stance that you choose determines the target number that you need to equal or exceed to hit an opponent, and that's also the target number that your opponent also has to equal to exceed to hit you. So it's a double-edged sword. So if you're in the forward stance, that means that you're in an all-out attack mode and you're not paying much attention to your defense. The target number for you to hit the enemy or for the enemy to hit you is a target number of 6, plus whatever your parry rating is on your character sheet that's determined when you create your character. And if you carry a shield, that also adds a static number to your parry rating as well. And that gets added into your overall target number to be hit. And the same thing if you're attacking the enemy. Their parry rating gets added into their target number to be hit, and if they're carrying a shield, that gets entered in as well. The second stance is the open stance, which I use orange to indicate that stance. The open stance basically just means that you're paying equal attention to attacking and defending. The target number to hit or to be hit in the open stance is a 9. The next stance is defensive stance. I use green to indicate defensive stance. Defensive stance means that you're paying more attention to your defense than you are your offense. So, and you can also try to use defensive stance to defend other allies. I'll get into that in a second. Defensive stance, the target number for you to hit an opponent or for them to hit you is a target number 12. And last but not least is rearward stance, which is blue in my game. And in rearward stance, the target number for you to hit an opponent is 12, or for them to hit you is 12 as well. And remember, you add in your parry, and if you're carrying a shield, that also adds a bonus. Now, rearward stance is special because there's a couple of extra rules that you have to go by to be in rearward stance, which is where you're back sniping with a bow and arrow. There have to be at least 2 people in a close combat stance, which is forward, open, or defensive, for you to be able to drop back into rearward stance. And also, if there's like twice as many bad guys as there are people in your group, in your company, then you cannot take a rearward stance because you're being overrun, basically. So you always have to remember those rules. Now, if you have many more good guys, like many more people on your side than there are monsters, you can allow for more people to take a rearward stance. So you can kind of break the rules if the situation is more advantageous for your group. And the Lore Master's Guide kind of tells you. It's very basic. If you have a lot more heroes than there are monsters, then more people can take a rearward stance. You don't necessarily have to have 2 people for each person that's in a rearward stance to take up a close combat stance. The next thing that you determine before you actually get into the combat is if you get an opening volley. Now, the way it's determined is it's totally up to the Lore Master. You're usually entitled to at least 1 opening volley at all times when you go into combat, except for if you're surprised. If you're surprised in combat, you don't necessarily get an opening volley, unless you have a special trait, which my character does, that allows you to get off a volley. You get 1 extra volley by having the Woodland reward, because I have a 2 in my Valor rating, and I kind of explained that in one of my previous videos, how Valor and Wisdom works. So since I had a 2 when I created my character, I got my first reward. I got a Woodland bow, and that allows me to get off an extra volley in addition to a normal volley that the Lore Master would award us. And even if I'm surprised, I still get at least 1 volley by having this special reward, a special type of bow. But generally speaking, you get 1 volley every time you go into combat. Now, if the distance is great between the 2 sides at the beginning of a combat, like the bad guys are closing in on you, the Lore Master may allow you to have 2 volleys or so, more than 1 volley. And each side gets to take a volley at the other side. And what a volley is a ranged attack, basically. So any of your guys in your party that are carrying ranged weapons can get off basically a free shot in the opening volley as the sides are closing in on each other for close combat. So you resolve those, and any results that happen as a result of those volleys is taken into account immediately. So if you suffer damage, it comes off immediately as you get hit in the opening volleys. Once all the sides have engaged, you now have close combat happens. So depending on what stance you're in, that's going to tell you your target numbers to hit your opponents and their target numbers to hit you. And you basically resolve attacks, and basically all combat ensues at that point. Now, to make an attack, the way it works is, and I'm going to fast forward here on my PDF to close combat attacks so I don't leave anything out. To make an attack, you're going to roll the feat die, of course, which is the 12-sided die. You always roll this die for every kind of roll you do in the game. It's a wild die, essentially. And a number of these 6-sided success dice equal to your rating in a weapon. So if you look on my character sheet, my main weapon is my bow, and I have a 3 in the bow skill. And you'll notice that bow is underlined. What that means, anytime you underline a skill, that means that it's a favored skill for my character. Favored just means that whenever you use an attribute bonus, and I just discussed this earlier, when you enact an attribute bonus by spending a hope point, you get to add that attribute that governs that skill as a bonus to your attack roll or whatever kind of roll it is that you're trying to perform. And you can do that even after you roll an unsuccessful skill check. You can decide, I'm going to spend a point of hope to add my attribute bonus as a bonus to that roll. So the fact that my bow is a favored skill means that when I enact an attribute bonus, the skill that governs bow, I don't use the base skill like I talked about earlier, the base attribute, like body 5, heart 2, etc. You would use the bigger bonus, which is your favored bonus. So whenever a skill is favored, you use the favored attribute